Hello, everyone. This is Pastor Ryan Pronzinski of Christ Lutheran Church in Michigan Center, Michigan, and this is my Chair Chat Daily Devotional for Tuesday, May 12, 2020. Peace be with you. These devotions, video devotions, are intended to help you engage your life of faith during this time of pandemic, and so I encourage you all to take the time you need throughout these videos to pause, reflect, journal, have conversations with those around you as you would at any other type of Bible study or faith formation event. I also highly encourage you to leave constructive comments, questions, or prayer requests in the comments section below, and I promise I will get back to those in the following videos. The readings that are used in these videos come from the Daily Revised Common Lectionary, which is a church calendar schedule of readings that can be found online. The readings for today are Psalm 102, verses 1 through 17. For details on that reading, which I will not be doing today, see the video from May 11. The other readings are Proverbs 3, verses 5 through 12, and Acts chapter 7, verses 44 through 56. And this is a continuation of 2 other days' worth of readings. It's St. Stephen, his speech before he is stoned to death. So see May 8 and May 11 for other thoughts on Stephen's speech. Before I get to the readings themselves, as always, I like to invite any of you out there watching these videos to come and join us at Christ Lutheran Church for worship on Sundays. We live stream our Sunday morning services, which take place at 9:45 a.m. Eastern Standard Time through Facebook Live. A link to our Facebook Live services can be found in the description below, along with all the readings for today. So please click on that link and join us for worship. And if you can't make it for the live stream, please feel free to watch the service afterward. We're happy to have you. Okay, so on to our first reading, which comes from Proverbs 3, verses 5 through 12, which reads as follows. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not rely on your own insight. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he shall make straight your paths. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord, and turn away from evil. It will be healing for your flesh and a refreshment for your body. Honor the Lord with your substance, and with the first fruits of all your produce. Then your barns will be filled with plenty, and your vats will be bursting with wine. My child, do not despise the Lord's discipline, or be weary of his reproof. For the Lord reproves the one he loves, and a father the son in whom he delights. Here ends the reading. As I finish this section in Proverbs today, I am honestly, and this might sound strange as a pastor, I'm left wondering this. What does it mean for you or for me or for us as a community, as a society, as a people, right now, and I want to stress right now, to trust in the Lord with all our heart or our strength, or as I like to think of it, with our whole being, with the core of who we are, with our very substance or essence, right, as the proverb gets translated in English today. And in part, why I even ask this question, right, what it means to trust in the Lord with our very being, is that there is no simple, cookie-cutter, one-size-fits-all way to live out one's faith in this way, because trust and faith, at least in the Greek in the New Testament, are the same word. Right? So there's no cookie-cutter way of doing this. People might want to make faith black and white, but it's much more nuanced than that, because we are all created differently, with different gifts in different times, in different places, different circumstances. And so things are going to look different depending upon who we are. And so God calls us into being in different ways. And this is so from the very beginning, right? First, it's God created humans, right? In Genesis 1, just humans. There was no distinction. But then it's and then God created them. Male and female, he created them, right? Then there becomes a distinction in the Hebrew from human to male and female. So we don't stay generic, right? God, even from the very beginning, makes distinctions and differences amongst us. And so not only are we called into different ways as persons and communities, but we are also called into different times and spaces and environments. In fact, yesterday we even talked about different times and seasons and markers, right? And one of the ways in which God might mark time for us, which we talked about yesterday, as we're losing our usual markers of time and seasons, celebrations and the like, because of social distancing, one of the ways God might mark time for us now is how God calls us anew each day to shift our way of being to fit the time we currently live in. To shift our way of being to fit the time we currently live in. And for most of us, right, to relate it directly to the text versus our own lives versus in the past and now, but to the text, we don't own farms or make produce. I know there are some farmers of you out there. God bless you for feeding us. You are a blessing. But most of us don't have farms or make produce that we can give to God, like in the proverb today. And we definitely don't do burnt offerings and take our produce and burn it up to as incense, if you will, before God. Right? But what's beautiful about this imagery, though, especially for this writer and the majority of people who were subsistence farmers in the day, that's how they, both fed themselves and their family, but also were able to barter and trade for things, is that giving produce was in fact an act of trust. Giving this food and this money, if you will, to God, because it was both and, is an act of trust. Right? As a farmer, especially a subsistence farmer, not a mass farmer producing more than you would ever need, and giving away your produce, right? And giving away your own food, that which you can barter with and get what you need, as you give this very vital necessity, this vital thing away that feeds you and helps you get what you need, you are trusting that as you give this away, the thing that you have right in front of you right now, and then will no longer have, right? You're trusting then that as you do this, that God will provide more. Right? I mean, it happens in the Exodus story as well. When they're in the wilderness, God tells them, take only what you need for the day. And even in our Lord's Prayer, we pray, give us this day our daily bread. Right? When you give things to God and you don't store them away indefinitely and hoard, right? It's an act of trust that God will provide you with what you need. That God is more than enough, that you are more than enough, and that God will provide you with more than enough of what you need. And so again then, what does trusting in the Lord with our whole beings look like today? Especially since this trust is linked with God's blessing in direction, right? About our vats overflowing, and God making straight our paths, directing our paths. We are told, again, right, that God will make our paths straight, will heal us, will fill us with plenty as we trust the Lord. So how do we do it? How do we trust the Lord? How do we lean into this trust holistically, right, and discover this blessed state described? I would say, just going in order of how things fall in the proverb, the first step that's listed is simply acknowledging God, although that's not terribly simple in our day and age anyway. And frankly, this is something we as human beings are not great at, especially in the United States of America. We have individualized, privatized, and largely segmented our life of faith. It becomes a me and Jesus kind of a thing, and that's it. Instead of seeing God and the transcendence of God, this God who we proclaim to be very personal and active and living in our daily lives, instead of seeing God and the transcendent as being a part of all aspects of our lives, always, We have quote unquote religious spaces and secular spaces. And so what this can look like is we quote unquote fight, to get prayer back in schools, as if people couldn't just do that anyway. I mean, yeah, you might not be able to do it in the way you would like, but you still can, and it's not even about that, right? Because somehow we've made these distinctions between like God somehow being in one space and not in another, and somehow we have to inject God back into a space as if God wasn't already there. Instead of just simply seeking to acknowledge God in our day-to-day lives, just do it. Like, who cares? Anyway, yeah. So we fight these arbitrary fights instead of just simply seeking to acknowledge God in our day-to-day lives, our relationships, and that includes our relationship with ourselves, right? We fail to acknowledge often that God is a part of it all. If God was not a part of it all, he would cease to be. God is the creator and sustainer of all life. God is always with you always, and with everyone else too, whether they acknowledge God or not. Right? Part of this blessedness that the writer of the Proverbs says is as we acknowledge God, there is a level of blessedness that comes to us, a level of healing, a level of life that we wouldn't experience otherwise. And so we don't often talk about God and our trust in God and how it helps direct our decision making with our finances, with our relationships, with the choosing of our vocations, how we vote, what we eat, and how we take care of ourselves. Seriously. Like, I think to myself, man, I'd sure love to have this junky food item, but you know what? I've already had some junky food items, and my body's a temple. And I don't say this to toot my own horn, but like, I've been given this gift. My life is a gift. It's not my own. I'm just a steward of this body and this life. It's not mine. It's God's. So how do I take care of it? Right? Taking care of one's body is an act of faith. How we spend our free time. Recreation, which is literally recreation, right? And God is a God of creation, is important. So not only like actually taking recreation time and free time, that's important. It's called Sabbath. But also how we do that. Are we doing it in a faithful way to who we are and who God is calling us to be? I don't even think people often think about this type of stuff. I remember one of my pastors at my home congregation, when he was doing a Greek Bible study, he was teaching people Greek, which, looking back on that now and having taken Greek now, I have no idea how he had the courage to do that, but God bless him. Anyway, my brother and I decided we wanted to do a summer bowling league, and so I had to say to my pastor, hey, I'm dropping out of this class because I'm going to go bowling with my brother. And I kid you not, these were his exact words to me. Oh, what a great opportunity to evangelize and meet new people and tell them about Jesus. Like, that was his mentality. Like, he understood that God was at the center of his very being and all of his life. And not just because he was a pastor, but that's where his life of faith was at. He realized, like, that's who God called us to be. And so I'll never forget that. So how we spend our free time, acknowledging God even in that. For people that trust that God is at the center of their very being, like my pastor whom I mentioned, no part of their life is somehow distinct or separated from God. None of it is. It's all connected. It's all related. And how couldn't it be? God, again, is the creator and sustainer of all life. People of faith seek to see God in all aspects of their lives, and then seek to follow where God leads. This is what acknowledging God looks like, right? And it's not simply about trying to inject God into one's life, right? But rather acknowledging that God is a part of it already. And what I mean by that is, please note that just because something is labeled quote-unquote Christian does not mean that it automatically, inherently makes God somehow more a part of that, or somehow more holy or godly, right? Because honestly, that's not always the case. Marketing is a very powerful tool. If you've never heard this, you hear it first here, right? The idea of labeling something Christian, and plenty of satirical shows have commented on this, that you throw Jesus in and you call it Christian, and people will snatch it up, man. They will just buy it. It's a moneymaker. It's used to get people to do all sorts of things. So please note that just because something is labeled Christian does not mean that God chose for it to be that way, and God is inherently behind it. God is always with those people, but might it be that God would rather do some disciplining in those situations and getting people to think and be differently than they are? Yeah. Anyway, I'll move on. Conversely, on the flip side, just because something isn't labeled Christian or is seemingly unreligious or secular, right, doesn't mean that God is not working through it. Just as my pastor acknowledged, oh, you want to be on a bowling league? That's a great opportunity to talk about Jesus, right? Or I would even go even further and say, meet Jesus in that space. I've met so many wonderful people in secular spaces that have become as Christ to me, right? And have discovered in them a faith that I didn't know they had because, again, we fail at acknowledging God in our lives, right? And so some biblical examples to just make this point even more robust is think of Cyrus. And if you don't remember who Cyrus is, he is the Assyrian emperor who the people of God had been enslaved to, taken into captivity by, right? And God says through one of the prophets, I don't remember which one, my servant Cyrus, who will rebuild the temple, right? That is the holiest site of the people of God at the time, is being rebuilt by a non-person of faith. Cyrus was not a Jew. He didn't believe in God. And yet God worked through Cyrus. To get even more ridiculous, I believe it's Kings. Could be wrong. Think it's Kings. Anyway, you can just look up Balaam's donkey, right? God uses a donkey to fulfill God's purposes. God is in all things and all people, even if it doesn't look like or seem like God would be, right? So this proverb reminds us that God is in fact a part of all things, since nothing can exist without God. All right, I've said that enough. Hopefully that's sinking in. So trusting God with our whole being means looking for God in all things, right? Trusting that God is already there. And then leaning into where God is leading us as we do look for God in this way. I just think of Jesus' words, seek ye first the kingdom of God, that is God's work in the world happening all around you. And then all these other things will be given unto you. All these other things will fall into place, right? So talk with people, right? Talk with people about how you see God at work in all aspects of your lives and how that affects your thinking and being. Just as I'm trying to do with you right now, right? You don't have to be a pastor to do that either. And this is what trusting through acknowledgement can look like. I'm sure there's other ways to talk about it. And unlike the writer of Proverbs, I want to just stress that this type of acknowledgement of God, of talking about God and looking for God in all aspects of our lives, it's going to take some real intentional effort and discipline. Because frankly, most people, even people of faith, right, don't automatically see God and God's presence as involved in all aspects of their life. Me, as a teenager, at my home congregation, I did not think about going to the bowling alley and bowling as an opportunity to both tell people about and see Jesus. But now, many years later, I go, duh, that makes so much sense now. So I'm trying to help you get you where I am now, because it's true. So, with the need for intentionality and acknowledging God in our lives, in order to lean into this blessedness, what does trusting in the Lord with your whole being look like today? Right? So that's something you can reflect on. This can be a longer video, just so you know, because I really am breaking this proverb down and still have the rest of Stephen's speech coming up. So if you need to pause, please do so. But what does trusting in the Lord with your whole being look like today? So firstly, again, just to be short about it, acknowledgement. Secondly, another point that trusting in the Lord with your whole being looks like practicing generosity. Practicing generosity. right? In verse 9, when the writer of Proverbs says, "Give the Lord your first fruits," this means giving God the very best, the cream of the crop, right? Not what's left over, not the dregs, not the crumbs, the very best. That bread fresh out of the oven, those cookies fresh out of the oven, right? And since we don't make burnt sacrifices anymore, like the people of Israel did, giving our best to God will look very different. We don't just burn it up as incense before God, as an act of trust that God will give us more. And so giving God our best should be directed toward our neighbor in need, right? I know the old school mentality of going to church used to be this, right? You put on your, quote, Sunday best. Okay, that's probably a familiar phrase to many of you. But quite frankly, and I'm saying this as a pastor, God doesn't need your Sunday best. Okay, they're just clothes. God, frankly, doesn't care about your outward appearance. God cares about your heart. Okay? So, what would it look like then to give your Sunday best to your neighbor who doesn't have Sunday best? Okay, they can't put on a Sunday best. They don't have a Sunday best to give. And then as you give your neighbor your Sunday best, because they need it more than God, and God will be pleased as you love your neighbor in this way, what would it look like to then say to them, I am being generous to you and giving you my best, because I believe you and I were created in the image of a generous God. Man, talk about one's cup overflowing if you were to share that with them in that way. For them to think about themselves through the lens of abundance instead of scarcity. To say to them, you are more than enough, and so I am giving you my very best. That just screams love. Yeah, and I just said that. Here's my notes again. And I believe, as you do this to your neighbor, you give them your Sunday best. You say to them, I believe that you deserve my best because God has made you and I more than enough. Oh, it's beautiful. It makes my heart smile. I hope it does yours. And what would it look like if we who have more than enough gave our very best to those who don't? What would the world look like if we lived that way? And I know utopias don't work. But again, this is who Jesus calls us to be. It's not just the Proverbs, right? Because Jesus understands that pockets of these types of communities and times and spaces of these communities and ways of being can in fact happen because God is at work. The kingdom of heaven is at hand. And when it happens, it's a beautiful thing. For me right now, I think of my wonderful Little Dresses for Africa people at Christ Lutheran who completely stopped doing the dresses right now because this time and space calls for masks. There are so many people that need them. And just a handful of ladies have made 200 masks to go to our local Jackson County Medical Care Facility. Right? That's giving those people their very best. Okay? And it's awesome. It inspires me. It's beautiful. And as I think of that question, what would it look like, right, to give our neighbor, if we all had the mentality of giving our neighbor our very best, not all of our best, but the first fruits, the cream of the crop. I imagine it would sound like this, to quote the proverb again. Then your barns will be filled with plenty, and your vats will be bursting with wine. No one would be without. Everyone would feel as though they were enough and would have enough. And that would be beautiful. And so you see, trusting in God with our whole being, it means living generously and being generous. And God working through you and I generously leads to abundance for all. So trusting the Lord with your whole being looks like acknowledging God regularly in your lives, 1, and 2, being generous, living generously with your neighbor and with the world. I could do a whole nother thing on care for creation, but I'm trying to focus on people today. But generosity toward our environment is also important because if we don't give the land Sabbath, which my professors have written some beautiful pieces on that, if we don't treat the land with generosity as well and give it rest and give it our best, then we won't have the first fruits anymore. Farmers already know this. The good ones do. You have to care for the world around us, otherwise it won't care back. Okay. And lastly, trusting the Lord with our whole being looks like being disciplined. Oh, and I know that's a scary word for people. And I don't mean punishment. I just want to start off by saying not punishment, but being disciplined. The word disciple and disciplined literally are from the same family. They kind of go hand in hand. And I know that's a scary word. Most people don't like being disciplined. That's why we have this instant gratification world we live in, where there's a pill for every problem, and we want things to go away quickly and with as little effort as possible. And that flies in the face of discipline. But trusting in the Lord with your whole being requires being disciplined and living a disciplined life. And I quite frankly think this last point is one of the most poignant ones today, because at a time when forgetting to wash your hands or keep your distance could literally kill not just one person, but multiple people, discipline takes on a whole new level of importance and love today. And quite frankly, if you've been in the military, this mentality is nothing new, right? This attention to detail and discipline, because it could cost people lives, is not a new thought for us, but for many other people it is. And again, often we think of discipline as punishment, but I would like to stretch that thought a little bit today. If you're still not with me, I'm going to keep the military example in the forefront here. And in our day and time, I want you to wonder and ponder, might discipline look more like thinking about your neighbor and the most vulnerable first, before you make decisions, right? Just as a service person does. You don't think about yourself, you think about the mission. You think about those whom you are serving as you make your decisions. How will this affect the mission? How will this affect the people that are trusting in me to do my very best, right? We are all wanting our personal barns and our vats to overflow, right? To get back to a sense of normalcy. That's how some might read that. Like, I want my me time so that my vats and my barns can overflow again. But to be able to get back to this sense of normalcy for ourselves, in this place of personal abundance, might we first need to place communal abundance and the needs of others first, by being disciplined and thinking about how our actions will affect others first. This is how the entire military is able to be so highly efficient, because this is the mentality that is drilled into your head and your heart from the very beginning. We are all in this together. If one person makes a mistake, we're all hurt, right? If one person succeeds, we all succeed. And so, discipline in basic training is to be ready to serve people, to serve you all out there. All the people that are in the military, going through training, they are being disciplined for you, right? That's their act of love and service to you. It's not punishment. And they do it out of love and then out of generosity, of knowing that they are more than enough because you, the people, are more than enough, right? That's what it means. And so think about that. Even though we may not name God a lot in the military, at least the act of serving, especially those guards men and women right now, that are helping serve meals and do tests and all that stuff right now, takes discipline, and it's an act of service and love. And even though this discipline can feel like punishment at times, especially at basic training, Lord have mercy, it's meant as an act of love and service, both to us from our trainers, but also to you, the people, as we do it. And so that type of discipline isn't just for the military. I just use that as an example because that's my experience. As we continue to be called, all of us, to be disciplined in our actions for the sake of others, might it help then to think of this act of discipline as an act of service and love and even trust in God, instead of thinking it as an act of being punished. Because right now, we are thinking about all the ways in which we need to be disciplined right now, keeping our social distance, not going to certain things, maybe not even going to work, not being able to hug people, hold a hand, shake a hand, give a high five, whatever, as an act of punishment. But have you really stopped and said, might this just be an act of love and hospitality, creating a space where people are safe, right, as an act of love? That doesn't get talked about very often on the news. It just gets talked about as public health and safety. But again, might this just be God working to show us how to love through discipline, right, as in the proverb? All right, for, as it says, God disciplines the one that God loves. All right, I have talked enough about Proverbs in this chair chat. In fact, it's been its own chair chat literally right now. So we're going to quickly read through the last reading, Acts chapter 7, verses 44 to 56. Again, look at May 8 and 11 for more details. And this is how it reads. Our ancestors had the tent of testimony in the wilderness, as God directed when he spoke to Moses, ordering him to make it according to the pattern he had seen. Our ancestors in turn brought it in with Joshua when they dispossessed the nations and God drove out before our ancestors. And it was there until the time of David, who found favor with God and had asked that he might find a dwelling place for the house of Jacob. But it was Solomon who built a house for him. Yet the Most High does not dwell in houses made with human hands. As the prophet says, Heaven is my throne and earth is my footstool. What kind of house will you build for me, says the Lord? Or what is the place of my rest? Did I not make all these things? Say, there again, God is in all things. We try and make spaces for God, but God's like, dude, I made you. Why are you making things for me? You stiff-necked people, uncircumcised in heart and ears, you are forever opposing the Holy Spirit, just as your ancestors used to do. Which of the prophets did your ancestors not persecute? They killed those who foretold the coming of the righteous one, and now you have become his betrayers and murderers. You are the ones that received the law as ordained by angels, and yet you have not kept it. When they heard these things, they became enraged and ground their teeth at Stephen. But filled with the Holy Spirit, Stephen gazed into heaven and saw the glory of God and Jesus standing at the right hand of God. Look, he said, I see the heavens opened, and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. Here ends the reading. All right, so this is the end of Stephen's speech, the first Christian martyr, before he is stoned to death. He's just giving this recounting of Israel's history to show that the killing of Jesus and even his own death fits into God's story already. All the true prophets, the people that God has elected to lead and teach the people what they ought to do and be who the people need, have all been mistreated this way. And so he's just kind of trying to validate Jesus as Messiah, and then the followers of Jesus as valid as well. And so it's quite amazing, though, in light of today's chair chat itself, that as Stephen is about to die, his last act is to acknowledge the Lord, right? Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. Acknowledge him in all your ways, and he shall make your paths straight. Stephen acknowledges the Lord. It's just amazing. He says, quote, I see the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. Those are his last words. It's pretty sweet. And so Stephen just reemphasizes that part of trusting God with our whole being is acknowledging God in all of our lives, even at the very end. Even if this acknowledgement might cause us personal loss, as it does to Stephen. Right? Stephen's barns in this life were not filled, but he was brought to fullness of life with God. The promise is still kept, just not in the way that many of us are possibly taught. Christianity is not about a prosperity gospel where if we do everything right, then we're going to be rich and fat and happy. Stephen shows that to not be true. However, one, as I said, God brings him to fullness of life with him. So in that sense, he is given treasure in heaven where moth and rust cannot destroy, as Jesus would say. But also, here's getting back to discipline and loving the neighbor, right? And giving our neighbor our Sunday best. His witness, Stephen's witness, continues to fill our lives with blessings. I can't tell you how many people, countless people, look to the story of Stephen for inspiration and hope. In fact, I had friends growing up whose birthright, their name, Stephen, was after this martyr, right? Because of the blessing of Jesus and this story about how Jesus is with us, right? So Stephen is a good reminder that our life of faith is not always about ourselves. In fact, I might even argue that the majority of the time it's really not about us. It's about our neighbor. It's about those around us. And our trust in God isn't always about ourselves either, but about showing others where God is in their lives, even if it costs us a great deal. And that is the one of the overarching narratives of Acts. And you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria, and all the ends of the earth. Our lives are not our own. Our lives are not about ourselves. Our faith is not our own. Our faith is not simply about ourselves, but about bearing witness to Jesus in the world around us. And about doing this, about acknowledging God, about showing people where God is in their lives, even if it costs us a great deal, right? Because for them, as we do, and they are able to trust in it, that's when their vats and their barns will overflow, because ours already are. We have the most precious gift and treasure already. We have Jesus. The rest of the world doesn't, you know? Anyway, in the end, though, we are reminded by Stephen that God is with us in all things, right? Leading us from death to life. And so I hope this last point, right? That I know Stephen dies and gets stoned to death, and it's terrible and it's tragic. But this life is full of tragedy and terrible things. And Stephen is a great reminder that God is with us in all things. All things. God is with you in all things. So I hope that this good news is what helped you to trust the Lord with all your whole being, now and always. And so with that, I say I will talk to you tomorrow.